see, and that he makes us righteous through it, a remedy was offered to me in my affliction. Well, the Pharisees never did come to that discovery. People hadn't come to that discovery, and the world doesn't come to that discovery. The world basically is on the trail to God of being good. The Pharisees were sickeningly self-righteous. Or as Walter Liefeld says, they are obnoxiously self-righteous. And that's why you have a further description of them at the end of verse 9. Not only did they trust in themselves that they were righteous, but they viewed others with contempt. They viewed others with contempt. Contempt is the worst scorn that you can heap on somebody. Luke 23:11, the only two times this word is used in the Gospels, once here in 18 and once again in 23:11. Herod with his soldiers, after treating Jesus with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Scorn, ridicule, mockery, sarcasm, the lowest form and the most biting form of derision. The Pharisees were that way. They looked at anybody below them outside their group with contempt. The word, I think, is interesting enough to kind of break down, exoutheneo. It comes from two words, as do many Greek terms, many of the verbs combining a preposition at the beginning. Ek, out of, uden, not even. Out of not even anything. The nobodies, the nothings, the non-existents. They viewed them as if they didn't exist. By the way, that same word is used by Peter in Acts 4 when he preached a sermon, and he said this about Jesus: he is the stone which the builders rejected. That's the same verb. Jesus was treated as if he was nothing, absolutely nothing. By the way, the word is also used in 1 Corinthians 1, where the Lord has chosen the base things and the despised, the nothings and the nobodies God has chosen. So there is, in this self-righteousness, in this pride, a contempt for anybody beneath you. The Jews, the law keepers, were called the Habarim, and the lawbreakers were called the Amharitz, the lowlifes. And in the eyes of the Pharisee, he couldn't get near to anybody who was an Amharitz. That was an absolutely unthinkable thing for him to do. Kenneth Bailey writes, in the eyes of a strict Pharisee, the most obvious candidate for the classification of Amharitz would be a tax collector. But there was a particular kind of uncleanness that was contracted by sitting, riding, or even leaning against something unclean. This uncleanness was called midras uncleanness, and for Pharisees, he writes, the clothes of an Amharitz count as suffering midras uncleanness. They didn't get near any of the lowlifes and the riffraffs that they disdained. Not even so much as to teach them the law of God. And so here we have these two men, and they are at extreme poles, and they're going to be the ones that convey the message Jesus wants to convey to the people who think they can be good enough to get to heaven on their own. The audience is really universal, a comprehensive audience. Second point, the contrasting analogy. The contrasting analogy. Verse 10. 2 men went up into the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, and the other a tax gatherer. The Pharisee stood and was praying thus to himself, God, I thank thee that I'm not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax gatherer. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get. We'll stop there. What's the scene here? 2 men went up to the temple to pray. It happened twice a day, basically. Every day. 9 a.m., 3 p.m. Morning and evening sacrifice, prescribed for the burnt offering, which was laid out in the first chapter of Leviticus. They were to go up and make an animal sacrifice, a blood sacrifice, as a symbol of atonement. That was a very, very important thing. They were very, very fastidious people who made sure they showed up at 9 a.m. and at 3 p.m. every day, particularly Pharisees who were in the proximity and could do that. The crowd would go up the steps at the prescribed time. The sacrifices would be offered on the altar. Following the sacrifices, which would symbolically open the way to God because atonement had been made, incense would be burned, symbolizing prayer. Now, because atonement has been made, prayers can be offered. And prayers would be offered. There would come a priestly benediction upon the people who were faithful enough to be there as well. And that would be the typical scene. When it says they went up to the temple to pray, pray would embody all of the worship, all of the activities that went on. The temple, according to Matthew 21:13, by the mouth of Jesus himself, is a house of prayer. Remember, Jesus said, "My Father's house is a house of prayer," taking the language from Isaiah 56:7, and you've turned it into a den of thieves. A house of prayer, prayer synonymous with worship, a house where you go to offer yourself and your petitions and your praise to God. It was that time, and the crowd ascended the long, steep steps up to the Temple Mount. They went up, anabino, they ascended up there to worship. The two men are in the crowd, and everybody would understand this very familiar scene. Every morning, every afternoon, the same scene went on. They're going up there because an atonement is going to be made for sin. Some are going up there feeling they need the benefits of that atonement. Some are going up there to display themselves, and they're just looking for a crowd to gather for that purpose. There would be a time when all of the people would gather around the altar as the sacrifice was being made, after which the incense being burned, people would then pray. The Pharisee, very familiar to us. We don't need to say any more about them. You know all there is to know. Self-righteous, self-promoting, self-satisfied purveyors and protectors of the religion of human achievement. Tax collector, also familiar. We've seen tax collectors already in 4 chapters. This is the 5th time. And we know they were the lowlifes of that society because they had purchased tax franchises from the Romans, who were the idolatrous oppressors, thus desecrating themselves. They then extorted money from their own people using strong-armed thugs and any intimidation, manipulation, or criminal activity they could, and were surrounded by the lowlife riffraff of society. So they are shown going up together with the crowd, but they separate when they get there. And first we see the Pharisee. The Pharisee stood. Nothing wrong with standing. In fact, standing was an acceptable and, frankly, normal posture for prayer. There were many other postures. Kneeling, lying prostrate was also a proper posture for prayer. Hands down, hands up, eyes down, eyes up. But it was a common way to pray. Put your hands up, lift your eyes up, standing. We see that many times in Scripture. We see it with Solomon in 1 Kings 8, standing to pray. Nehemiah 9, the leaders of Israel standing to pray.